She wrote,
Save these dates. Save these dates. February 19th through the 23rd, 2023. The West Coast Churches of Christ Annual Preachers and Leaders Forum returns to the Bay Area, hosted by the Bay North and McDonald Avenue congregations, to be held in Fairfield, California. Register now at www.wcplf.com. That's the West Coast Preachers and Leaders Forum. Good evening and welcome to the Gospel Truth. I'm Alan Jackson, bringing to you spiritual songs and hymns and the power of the spoken word of God. First of all, giving thanks to God Almighty for blessing me with this another outpouring of His tender love and mercy, and that He's allowed me once again to be on this time side of life and to have this another blessed privilege to come to you in His name by way of this television medium and to bring to you another message from His holy and divine word. And I'm praying on your behalf as participant observers. And it is my prayer that God will continue to bless you and your family with all of those things that He knows that you're standing in need of as well. So again, I want to welcome you to the February 2023 Gospel Truth Tribute to Black American History. And so this evening, we're going to take a crash course on Miss Toni Morrison.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. The difficulty for me in writing, among the difficulties, is to write language that can work quietly on a page for a reader who doesn't hear anything. Toni Morrison said in a 1993 interview with the Paris Review, going on to say, "Now for that, one has to work very carefully with what is in between the words, what is not said. When I first encountered Toni Morrison's work in high school, it was most often atop a sea of unmade sheets on my bed, with two pillows propping me up against the headboard. I used one of those cheap drugstore pens to underline the sections that most resonated. It was tough for me then to read in places where there was a lot of noise. I preferred reading and writing in my room, where I could listen to the soft scratch of ink on paper and the ceiling fan whirring above. Which is to say, I first encountered Morrison's words in the silence that she alludes to. In this series, we've talked about a number of authors who have used their work to share the lives and experiences of Black Americans on the page. And the person we're discussing today, Toni Morrison, is one of the best writers that this country has ever produced. She changed the literary landscape. She challenged the traditionally white male canon of literature, and she did it on her own terms. Let's start the show. I don't know how else to put it. Toni Morrison is a legend. She published everything from plays to children's books. Her novels earned many prestigious awards, including the Pulitzer Prize and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She also was the first Black American woman to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. Much of her work centers on the stories of Black people at different points throughout American history. She talks about their highs and their lows, their triumphs and their failures, and the consequences of racism in everyday life. Her work emphasizes the loss, memory, psychological trauma, and joy of Black life. She wrote in ways that remain enjoyable to everyday readers, while inspiring writers of all races. She helped highlight Black American literature, serving as a catalyst for it to be nationally and internationally recognized. Toni Morrison was born Chloe Wofford in 1931. Chloe was the second of 4 children. She grew up in Lorain, Ohio, in an environment where segregation wasn't the law, but the invisible lines were understood. Although her family struggled in the aftermath of the Great Depression, she credits her childhood as what motivated her to eventually write. Hearing African-American folklore and music learning cultural rituals, and growing up working class. When she was 12 years old, Chloe converted to Catholicism. She was baptized under the name Anthony for St. Anthony of Padua, and it would be under the nickname Tony that she would become world famous. After graduating with honors from Lorraine High School in Ohio in 1949, she attended Howard University. Tony experienced the dangers and horrors of the segregated South while touring with the Howard Players, an acting club. But she also started to connect with other Black writers, activists, and artists. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in English in 1953 and then went on to complete her Master of Arts in American Literature from Cornell University in 1955. After she obtained her master's, she taught English at various HBCUs. She married Harold Morrison, an architect, and had 2 children. In 1958, she returned to Howard University as a lecturer and joined a writing group where she would begin working on her first novel. She spent 7 years at Howard University, got divorced, and then became an editor of the textbook division of Random House Publishing, where she quickly moved up the ranks. She eventually became a senior editor at Random House, the only Black American woman to hold that position in the company at the time. Morrison used her power and influence as an editor to publish many books by Black American writers, including Toni Cade Bambara, Gail Jones, June Jordan, and Angela Davis. Many credit her with introducing a whole new group of Black writers to the wider world. While elevating the Black authors around her by putting their work into print, Morrison started to put her own work in the spotlight. Remember that novel she started working on at Howard a few years earlier? Well, after waking up at 4 a.m. each morning to work on it, while raising her 2 children on her own, it became her first published novel, The Bluest Eye. It came out in 1970 when Toni was 39 years old. The Bluest Eye is about Pecola Breedlove, a young Black girl who had an extremely difficult childhood and believed that her life would be better if she just had blue eyes, like the white people around her. It was seen by some as a controversial book, and it was met with pretty mixed reviews. But Toni Morrison stated in later interviews that the book's reception was very similar to how other characters treated her main character in the novel. Morrison said she was dismissed, trivialized, misread. The lack of a warm initial reception for The Bluest Eye didn't stop Morrison. She published her second novel, Sula, only 3 years later. In this book, Morrison explores morality, ethics, and relationships through the friendship between 2 Black women. This book had a much more positive reception than The Bluest Eye, and it was even nominated for a National Book Award. By the time Morrison published her third novel, Song of Solomon, in 1977, she was a household name in the Black community. This was one of the few books Morrison wrote with a male protagonist, a young man searching for his identity while trying to escape an oppressive society. This was her first truly commercially successful book. It became the first book written by a Black American author to be selected by the Book of the Month Club since Richard Wright's Native Son in the 1940s. She received a National Book Critics Circle Award, along with many other accolades. The book became a staple of American literature in classrooms, among academics, and for general readers. This success encouraged Morrison to become a full-time writer. In 1987, Morrison released what many consider to be her magnum opus, Beloved. The book is inspired by the true story of Margaret Garner, an African-American woman who was living in slavery. The main character of Beloved is Setha, a formerly enslaved woman who was constantly haunted by her dead child after making the gut-wrenching decision to kill her children rather than see them become enslaved. Though 3 of her children survived, her infant daughter did not. Morrison dedicates the book to the millions of Africans killed during the course of the Atlantic slave trade. The title of the book is taken from Romans chapter 9, which states, quote, "Those who were not my people, I will call my people, and her who was not beloved, I will call beloved." The story explores themes of loss, morality, and the impossible choices that befall the oppressed. The book became an enormous critical and commercial success. It was a bestseller for 25 weeks and won many awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. From the 1980s onward, Morrison's literary prowess impacted the minds and hearts of much of the world. She continued to win awards and honors throughout her life, she became a professor in the creative writing program at Princeton University. In 1993, she became the first black woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 1996, she was chosen by the National Endowment for the Humanities to give the Jefferson Lecture, and also won the National Book Foundation's Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. Also, Oprah Winfrey loved her. I mean, really, really loved her. It was Oprah who helped bring Toni Morrison's work even further into the mainstream when she selected 4 of Morrison's novels in 6 years for her book club. With an average of 13 million viewers watching these book club segments, the support from Oprah helped Morrison sell millions of copies and gave her an even bigger sales boost than she experienced when she won the Nobel Prize. In 1998, Beloved was even made into a movie, starring, well, Oprah, as well as Thandiwe Newton and Danny Glover. And honestly, the rest is history. Morrison received a dozen honorary degrees and was a guest curator at the Louvre Museum in Paris. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was awarded to her by the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama. In total, she wrote 11 novels, 9 nonfiction works, 5 children's books, 2 short stories, and 2 plays throughout her life. She died on August 5th, 2019, in New York City. Several years ago, before she passed away, I had the opportunity to see Morrison give a lecture in person. It was an extraordinary experience to physically be in the presence of one of the greatest writers to have ever lived. When Morrison came onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet and gave a resounding round of applause. Whistles and cheers ricocheted across the vastness of the room. Morrison was brought to a table at the front of the stage, cloaked in a red cloth that had a small glass of water at its corner. At 85 years old, she was still remarkably lucid. As I listened to her speak, I thought of my future children, how one day they will read Morrison, and how they might marvel at the fact that their father once shared a room with this writer who seemed to belong to another world. I will tell them that when she spoke, the vowels stretched across the theater like a hammock. I will tell them that her laughter pushed open the walls of the room and invited everyone in. Morrison laid the foundation for generations of black writers that followed. She rejected the idea that being black or being a woman might hinder her appeal or the universality of her work. In a 1987 interview with the New York Times, Morrison said, quote, "I really think the range of emotions and perceptions I've had access to as a black person and as a female person are greater than those of people who are neither. So it seems to me that my world did not shrink because I was a black female writer. It just got bigger. Morrison is gone now, but she indeed made the world bigger. She built upon her literary ancestors and paved the way for her literary descendants. She is one of the best writers to have ever lived, and she transformed our understanding of what literature could do."
And this is a crash course on Barack Obama.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. My grandfather was born in Mississippi in 1930. Sometimes, when he tells me the stories of his childhood, I get overwhelmed. 1930s Mississippi, and honestly, just 1930s America, was a place where state-sanctioned segregation was the norm, where violence against black people was widespread, and where the possibility of lynching remained an omnipresent threat. Racism was everywhere. When he finished middle school, my grandfather even had to move to live in an entirely different county because the county where he was born and raised didn't have a high school for black people. Additionally, a man in a tiny 1,000-person town where he lived was lynched there when he was a boy. This is the America my grandfather was born and raised in. And this is why, when Barack Obama was elected the President of the United States in 2008, my grandfather was astounded that he lived to see this moment. He told me he simply could not have imagined the prospect of a black president leading the country and a black family living in the White House as legitimate possibilities in his lifetime. To see a black man become president in a country so thoroughly racism Autism almost seemed more like science fiction than reality. But it was reality. And Barack Obama's journey to and presence in the White House inspired many, angered many, and impacted American politics in a way that changed it forever. Let's start the show. We know from some previous episodes that Barack Obama was not the first Black American to run for president. He was preceded by Shirley Chisholm in 1972, the first Black woman to seek the nomination from a major party, and also by Reverend Jesse Jackson, who ran in both 1984 and 1988 on a platform of building a multi-class, multiracial, rainbow coalition. What was significant about President Obama's candidacy was not only the fact that he was the first Black man to be nominated by a major party, but also the fact that he won. Let's learn a little bit more about who he was in the thought bubble. Barack Obama was born in 1961 to a white mother from Kansas and a Black father from Kenya. He was raised mostly by his mother in Hawaii. Then when he was 6 years old, they moved to Indonesia after his mother remarried, which he later described as giving him a larger, more global perspective on the world. In 5th grade, he returned to Hawaii, where his grandparents still lived. And for high school, he received a scholarship to attend an elite school on the island. After high school, Obama spent 2 years at Occidental College in Los Angeles before he transferred to Columbia University, where he graduated with a major in political science. He then spent time as a community organizer in Chicago, working with many local churches to improve housing policy and job training programs. Frustrated with what he felt like were the limitations of grassroots work, Obama decided he wanted the tools to effect change on a larger scale. So in 1988, he attended Harvard Law School and became the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review. A few years later, in 1992, he would marry Michelle Robinson, a lawyer who was also a graduate of Harvard Law, who he met while working at a law firm in Chicago. They would go on to have 2 daughters, Malia and Sasha. In 1996, Barack Obama was elected to the Illinois State Senate, and in 2004, he was elected to be one of Illinois' U.S. senators. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, there's so much more that we could say about Barack Obama's early life, and if you want to learn more about him and his journey, there are many documentaries, and he has multiple memoirs, including Dreams from My Father, released in 2004, and A Promised Land, released in 2020. But we are going to fast forward to his election and his presidency. By the time that Barack Obama was running for president in 2007 and 2008, America had a lot going on. The country was involved in increasingly unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans were facing the worst financial disaster since the Great Depression, and as a result, Americans were losing their jobs, homes, and retirement savings at extraordinary rates. Black Americans, as has been the case throughout so much of American history, were disproportionately hurt by all of the mortgage foreclosures and job losses. It is estimated that Black people in the U.S. lost between $71 and $122 billion in housing assets alone. Barack Obama's campaign really focused on these issues. He promised to end the war in Iraq and save the American middle class. He also promised to put an end to partisan, racial, and economic divides and to unite the country. These promises resonated with folks who felt worn out by the financial disaster and frustrated by a political system that seemed like it could never get anything done. His campaign was particularly energizing to young people who were drawn to Obama's theory of change and saw him as someone who represented a new, more diverse, more progressive direction for America. And so, after a long, hard-fought campaign against Arizona Senator John McCain, Barack Obama became the first African-American president of the United States in 2009. In the early days of his presidency, he got to work attempting to fulfill many of his campaign promises. He supported reforms to the financial system like the Dodd-Frank and Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. He outlawed the torture of prisoners who were detained during the War on Terror, removed some of the restrictions on federal funding for stem cell research, ended the ban on federal grants for international groups providing abortion services and counseling, and named Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court, making her the first Supreme Court justice of Hispanic descent. After evaluating the consequences of the Great Recession, it pushed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act through Congress. Hundreds of billions of dollars in stimulus was designed to shore up the economy in the midst of financial crisis. Tax incentives and benefits designed to help people who were recovering from financial crisis were an essential part of the bill. It did pass, but it passed with only partisan support. No Republicans supported the legislation in the House, and only 3 moderate Republicans voted for it in the Senate, which was indicative of the growing partisanship that would become a major factor in Obama's presidency. But in the midst of all this, President Barack Obama's approval rating was at 62% in the first 100 days of his term. Barack Obama also made huge strides in the area of healthcare. After a long and polarized political battle, Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, a 2-part law containing 1, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and 2, the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act. The ACA would come to be known by many as Obamacare. Among other things, the legislation sought to improve access to medical coverage for everyone in the United States, keep insurance companies from raising premiums for individuals with pre-existing conditions, and to allow people to stay on their parents' insurance up to age 26. Obama was trying to accomplish a whole lot as president. But it's important to note that simply being president didn't mean that he was safe from racism and prejudice. In many ways, it made him even more of a target. Some members of the Republican Party, as well as conservative media outlets, questioned his U.S. citizenship and forced him to show his birth certificate to prove that he was American, something that was a highly unusual request and one that many scholars refer to as being explicitly racist. According to political scientists Ashley Jardina and Michael Traugott, among white Americans, birther beliefs are uniquely associated with racial animus. There were even times during his presidency where congressional leaders publicly disrespected him. Infamously, Representative Joe Wilson yelled out, "You lie," in the middle of a speech Obama was making to a joint session of Congress. Sometimes, people would even attack President Obama's family. For example, throughout his campaign and presidency, political cartoons portrayed his wife Michelle using caricatures and stereotypes. Obama's presidency also saw the rise of the Tea Party, an extremely conservative offshoot of the Republican Party who, as part of their platform, ginned up opposition to his presidency through large public rallies, which sometimes included racial slurs. There were multiple instances throughout his presidency where Barack Obama was criticized for his handling on issues of race. For example, in 2009, Henry Louis Gates Jr., a professor at Harvard University, was arrested for disorderly conduct after he tried to enter his own home and was mistaken for a thief. Gates argued that this was an incident of racial profiling, when someone uses racist assumptions and stereotypes to make an assessment about a person or a group of people, usually as it relates to a crime. Gates called the situation fundamentally unfair. During a press conference where he discussed the incident, President Obama said, quote, "I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that. But I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting someone when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know, separate and apart from this incident, is that there's a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. And that's just a fact." Obama's press conference and political energy was meant to focus on healthcare. But this comment ended up getting all of the media attention. He received pushback from the Cambridge police, and conservative media pundits called Obama racist for suggesting that the police officers' actions may have been motivated by race. Ultimately, Obama invited both Dr. Gates and the white officer to the White House for a beer summit to cool off tensions and get past it. Another big incident during Obama's presidency was the death of Trayvon Martin. We'll talk about this more in the Black Lives Matter episode, but the very short and very sad version of the story is that in 2012, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black boy, was shot and killed by a neighborhood watch volunteer named George Zimmerman. The event is considered by many to be the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. President Obama gave a speech addressing the issue and addressing his pain as a black man over it, saying that, quote, "If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon." Because of this comment, he was accused by some conservatives of dividing the country. Obama worked hard to make his political and policy agenda one that Americans saw as universal. As the first black president, he wanted to avoid accusations that he was trying to help black people more than any other group. Still, he and his administration did work to address issues that disproportionately impacted the black community. For example, in 2013, Attorney General Eric Holder began to focus on reforming federal mandatory minimum sentencing requirements. This was critical because these policies sent many black Americans to prison for minor drug offenses. He also created My Brother's Keeper, an initiative started in February of 2014 that sought to support black boys through mentorship, supplemental education, job training, and other interventions aimed at closing the opportunity gap between black boys and their peers. Additionally, following pressure from Black Lives Matter activists, the Department of Justice investigated several police departments that were known for engaging in violent policing tactics, including the police department responsible for the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. President Obama also established a task force on policing and rolled back the use of some military equipment by police. Still, many in the movement for Black Lives criticized Obama and said he didn't do enough to support young black activists or policies that would prevent black people from being the continued target of systemic injustice. For some, the presidency of Barack Obama represented the best of America, a place where a black kid from Hawaii with the middle name Hussein, with a Kenyan father and a Kansas mother, could ascend to the highest office in the land. For them, it represents how America is a place where anything is possible. For others, Obama's presidency was a disappointment and showed that simply having a black man in the presidential office wasn't enough to transform the lives of everyday black people. Still, his presence as a black man in the White House did have a major impact on our politics. After he was first elected, many Americans claimed that America was finally becoming a post-racial society. But as the movement for Black Lives, which began during his presidency, shows, this was far from the case. In fact, many scholars posit that it was the presidency of Barack Obama that put in motion a wave of racial resentment that continues to animate our politics today. Regardless of your political affiliation, Obama's presidency was and remains a consequential one. And over the course of his 8 years in office, especially in conjunction with the Black Lives Matter movement, the manner in which this country talked about race changed and evolved in ways that otherwise might not have happened. Thanks for watching.